Let's talk about something huge. We're diving into a fictional conflict that kicked off in the Middle East in March of 2026. Now, you might be thinking, that's thousands of miles away, why does it matter? Well, as we're about to see, the economic shockwaves from that war are hitting the African continent hard, and they're changing everything.
Okay, so first things first, we need to get our heads around this key idea, geoeconomic fragmentation. Look, this is way more than just politics as usual. This is when geopolitics starts to completely rewrite the global economic playbook. You've got old alliances cracking, new rival blocs forming, and it's throwing all the established rules of trade and finance right out the window. This idea is the foundation for everything we're about to unpack.
So, here's how we're going to break this all down today. Think of it like an hourglass. We're going to start wide, looking at the global spark, the war itself. Then we'll narrow in on the really specific impacts, the nitty-gritty of what's happening on the ground. And finally, we'll zoom back out to see what this new fractured world really means for Africa's future. Right, let's set the stage. The conflict that erupted in March 2026 wasn't just another regional war. No, this was a system-level shock. It fundamentally shook the entire global order. And even though the fighting is centered in the Middle East, Africa has, in many ways, become the main theater for the indirect and frankly devastating economic fallout.
And this is absolutely key. The impact isn't the same everywhere. It's not one giant wave hitting the whole continent at once. It's much more complex. It's creating a messy map of winners and losers. And where you fall on that map depends entirely on your country's specific vulnerabilities. Are you an oil importer or an exporter? How close are you to a major shipping lane? And how much do you rely on foreign cash to keep your economy running?
All right, so the first and most immediate shockwave, it all starts with energy. The crisis spread like wildfire through the global energy markets, and that destabilization was the first major blow to land. And at the heart of it all is this one tiny strip of water, the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, this 21-mile-wide choke point is literally the world's oil artery. We're talking up to 30% of all oil traded by sea, and a fifth of all natural gas passes through here. And now, the conflict has essentially slammed that gate shut. And the scale of this, I mean, it is just staggering. About 20 million barrels of crude oil, poof, just gone from the global market every single day. To put that in perspective, daily ship traffic through the strait has cratered by more than 98%. It went from about 138 ships a day down to just 2. It's an absolute catastrophe for global logistics.
So this is where the rubber really meets the road economically. In the scenario we're in now, a prolonged war, oil prices are hovering between $100 and $120 a barrel. For your average African economy, that means inflation could jump by as much as 7%, taking a huge bite out of economic growth. And if there's a full-scale blockade, we're talking double-digit inflation and a real risk of a continent-wide recession.
So what does that actually look like for people on the ground? Well, for the huge number of African countries that have to import their fuel, think Kenya, Ethiopia, the DRC, it's a nightmare. The price you pay at the pump goes up, which immediately makes transportation more expensive, which then makes the food on your table more expensive. It puts governments in an impossible position. Either you spend a fortune on subsidies and blow a hole in your budget, or you let prices rise and risk serious social unrest. There are no good options.
Now, you'd think oil producers like Nigeria would be popping champagne corks, right? Well, not so fast. It's a fascinating situation called the producer's paradox. Sure, Nigeria is earning more for the crude oil it sells, but here's the catch. It doesn't have enough refining capacity, so it has to turn around and import super expensive gasoline and diesel, which sends prices soaring at home. Any extra money the government makes is often wiped out by raging inflation and a very angry public. Okay, so that's the energy shock. But the second major blow comes from something much more physical, the actual movement of goods. Global shipping is being forced into a massive, expensive, and chaotic rerouting effort. Which brings us to a huge question. What actually happens when one of the world's most critical shipping lanes, the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, which handles something like 15% of all global trade, basically becomes a no-go zone? The entire system has to adapt on the fly.
And you can see the results right here. We're witnessing what's being called the Great Detour, with ships now sailing all the way around the southern tip of Africa. For Egypt, it's an economic disaster. Suez Canal revenues have tanked by up to 60%. But for a country like South Africa, it's a sudden chaotic boom. The port of Durban has seen a 45% jump in ship arrivals, but it's totally overwhelmed, creating huge backlogs and delays.
And here's a consequence that flies under the radar but is absolutely critical. We need to talk about the fertilizer crunch. Get this, about a third of the entire world's fertilizer supply moves through the Strait of Hormuz. With that route shut down, a crucial supply chain for feeding the planet has been broken, and that poses a direct threat to food security across Africa. And you can see the price shock right here. The cost of urea, which is a vital fertilizer, has shot up 45%. Think about what that means. For millions of smallholder farmers across the continent, this is just devastating. They can't afford the inputs they need to grow their crops, which means smaller harvests and ultimately higher food prices for everyone.
All right, now we're going to shift gears from the physical world of ships and cargo to the invisible but just as powerful world of finance. This is the third shockwave, and it's a war being fought with interest rates and capital flows.
This quote just nails it. A war halfway across the world acts like a hidden tax on everybody. But it's not a tax everyone pays equally. The developing economies, the ones that have to import their energy, are the ones who end up paying a much higher price.
But this sets off a really dangerous chain reaction. First, global investors get spooked, and they pull their money out of anything they see as risky, which unfortunately includes many African markets. This flight to safety makes it way more expensive for African governments to borrow money. At the same time, their local currencies get weaker, which makes paying back their existing loans in US dollars suddenly much more costly. And the end result? Money that should be going to hospitals and schools gets diverted to just paying off interest on debt.
And just to pour salt in the wound, a really crucial source of investment is drying up. For years, sovereign wealth funds from the Gulf were pouring money into Africa, building ports, funding renewable energy, backing startups. But now, with a war on their own doorstep, they're pulling that money back home to pay for their own security. This leaves a massive funding gap for so many projects that are critical to Africa's future.
Okay, so let's pull the camera back. When you put all these pieces together, the energy shock, the trade disruption, the financial panic, what do you get? You get a new, fractured reality for the continent. You get a whole new map of winners and losers.
And nothing illustrates this new reality better than looking at these two countries side by side. On one hand, you have Egypt, which is suffering a fiscal hemorrhage as its Suez Canal revenue vanishes. On the other, you have South Africa, which is having a surprise maritime moment. It now has this incredible opportunity to become a vital hub for global trade, but only if it can fix its own creaking infrastructure. It just perfectly captures how uneven these impacts are.
But you know, every crisis creates opportunity, and we're starting to see a huge one emerge in the energy sector. European countries are now frantically looking for energy supplies that don't come from the Middle East. They're making what's being called an African pivot, looking to places like Algeria and Mozambique. This could bring tens of billions of dollars in new investment. But there's a huge risk, betting the farm on massive fossil fuel projects right when the world is supposed to be moving away from them.
And all of this leaves us with one final massive question. The world is fracturing. For Africa, this has laid bare some deep, painful vulnerabilities. But at the same time, it has given the continent a new kind of strategic importance in energy, in global logistics, in geopolitics. The ultimate challenge, the question that hangs over everything, is whether the continent can figure out how to navigate this incredibly dangerous new world